Good morning or good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. We're going to be making a start in just a few seconds. We'll just allow another nearly a minute just to get a few more participants joined up. So we'll be starting in just a few seconds. Thanks. Good morning then, Excellencies, distinguished delegates. I have the great pleasure to welcome you to this side event on implementing digital identity systems without leaving anyone behind. And this event is part of the Third Ministerial Conference on Regional Economic Cooperation and Integration in Asia and the Pacific. And so we're doing the event in hybrid fashion, which means there's some of us here in the room. So it's not just me. I know the camera angle makes it look like there's two of us, but there are a few more, you'll be pleased to know, in the room. And then there are lots more people joining us virtually as well. So it's great to be able to have everyone. So I'm Rachel Bevan, and I'm the Director of Statistics Division here in Bangkok at ESCAP. And I've got the pleasure of moderating today's session. So I took over this role nearly 1 year ago, I think it's 11 months ago, and the first event that I attended in my new role, although it was virtual, was the Second Ministerial Conference on Civil Registration and Vital Statistics, where we looked at progress on the regional initiative to get everyone in the picture, which aims at improving civil registration and vital statistics in Asia and the Pacific. And it was at that event that we really saw the importance of civil registration and vital statistics and legal identity for all as being a really important thing that we need to accelerate progress on so we can meet the 2030 agenda. And that's at that event as well. I remember very clearly being part of the youth event and hearing them talking very personally about how that lack of legal identification was really impacting on some of their lives. So we know that these issues do matter. It's not just about, having the documents, but it is about this really makes a difference to people's lives. So the work on CRVS and on legal identity are just one part of our broader work at ESCAP to improve the quality of official statistics and the use of data for decision making in Asia and the Pacific. And what we've seen in recent years is that there's really been a renewed global momentum to ensure legal identity for all. And that's been great to see that, particularly looking at how that links as well to, again, a big push on civil registration and vital statistics. And we know that providing documents and records for individuals to establish their legal identity is a really important element of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. And it's actually also in Target 16.9. We know that governments in Asia and the Pacific are implementing civil registration and vital statistics systems, and often they're being underpinned by identity management systems, being used as well to issue national identity cards and numbers, as well as digital credentials for establishing unique identification and enabling secure identity verification. And what we're seeing as well is that increasingly this discussion is focusing not just on civil registration, but also on these additional identity credentials, such as digital ID. We know that full inclusion in digital identity systems is essential to facilitate access to the benefits and protections of the state. And so as services increasingly transition to digital, we also see that there can be disparities in coverage of hard to reach and marginalized populations. And we can see that sometimes through that shift to digital services, that can actually deepen that digital divide and leave more people behind. So it's particularly important that we look at issues like that to make sure that when we're implementing these systems, that they are actually being used to include everyone. And this was something that was highlighted at the CRVS ministerial event last year. So I'm really pleased today that we've got such a great lineup of speakers, and they're going to give us some real insights into how digital identity systems are functioning in some of the best systems in Asia and Pacific. And so we're going to hear today from 3 countries, Singapore, Armenia, and Australia. And we'll also be hearing from one of the big players in digital identity, Microsoft. So we're going to hear some very different perspectives and also hear, from very different countries about what they've been doing. Before we go on to hearing from the speakers, can I just also remind you that there will be time at the end for questions and answers. So please, as you listen to each of the presentations, do type your questions or any reflections you might have into the chat box. If you're in the room, you can also pass those questions directly to Tanya, who's on my left. But just make sure it's great. The more questions that we get, that's fantastic. But also you don't just have to ask questions. Do feel free as well to add your own experiences and share in the chat box as we're going through. So, as I said, we've got 4 great speakers lined up, and we're going to start with going to Singapore, and we're going to hear from Kendrick Lee, who's the director of the National Digital Identity Product Management Group in the Government Technology Agency of Singapore. And National Digital Identity is one of 8 strategic national projects that drives Singapore's Smart Nation vision. And Kendrick oversees product management of SingPass, and I see he's wearing the T-shirt as well. That's great. Application programming interfaces, as well as digital payments, with the aim of enabling secure and seamless transactions for residents, businesses, and government agencies. I'm not going to go through all of his kind of CV, but just to say he's also working as a lecturer as well in various places and doing a project with the Alan Turing Institute. So he has some great experience to share. So I'm going to pass over to him now to talk about the work they've been doing to build Singapore's national digital identity program. And just to say, I think you've got around 7 to 10 minutes. That would be great. Thank you very much. Over to you, Kendrick.
Thank you, Rachel, for the kind introduction. I trust everyone can hear me well. Good morning to everyone in Bangkok, and good afternoon and good evening to everyone else who's online, right? So I'm Kendrick from the Government Technology Agency of Singapore, and as Rachel mentioned, I handle product management of SingPass, which is our national digital identity. Now, I'm very privileged to, be the first speaker to start. But I want to just first recognize that, every country is different, in terms of culture and context, right? And while I provide an overview of what we have done, I think every country will approach this quite differently, right? And I hope to, at the end, just summarize with some critical success factors, which, we think were important to us here in Singapore, all right? So I think for us in Singapore, I think we are fortunate to have a foundational legal identity that's issued to all residents, right? So all citizens at birth have an ID number, and at 15 years old, you have an ID card, right? And if you are a resident or you're a foreigner who comes here to work, to live, or a dependent, you actually also issued an ID card, ID number upon pass approval, right? And our digital identity, which is called SingPass, is actually issued on the basis of this foundational legal identity, right? Which just enable us to issue SingPass to 95% of eligible users, right? And last year we had 450 million transactions on the platform, right? And it is widely used both in online and in face-to-face digital transactions. On the relying party side, right? So this refers to agencies and private sector businesses. SingPass is actually being offered as an authentication system or as a data exchange service for acceptance, right? By up to 2,000 digital services, right? So that means citizens can use SingPass at 2,000 digital points of presence across public and private sector, right? And this is a long journey that we have taken, right? Because SingPass actually originally started as a G2C authentication service 20 years ago, right? And so if you look at it, it's actually being used by government, by a lot of what we consider high assurance type services, such as in banking, as well as also in a range of other services where perhaps it's really more about user convenience, right? So if you were to, say, rent a car in Singapore, we now have digital car renting services where you can just sign on an app, verify using SingPass, and then drive the car away. Right. So if we talk about some of the benefits, right, and I'll use some examples from banking and fintech. Essentially, what this means is that for low-risk customers, when they open bank accounts in Singapore, it is a completely paperless, presenceless, fully digital, and instant process. Right. So the user goes to the bank's website, they authenticate using the SingPass, right? They agree to share data the government has of them with their explicit consent. The data is used to fill the bank's forms, right? And because the data comes from a trusted source, right, the bank is able to approve the product, right? And in some cases, instantly provision that product to the user's mobile phone in minutes, right? So this is a far cry from the times when we had to fill a form online, but still submit PDF documents. And then, you know, the approval and the product takes weeks to arrive, right? So basically, it's possible to get a credit card or a loan approved in minutes and to receive and use that account in minutes as well. In the realm of open banking, we have also used SingPass to enable SG Findex, which is our open banking data platform, right? So it's the world's first digital infrastructure to use national digital identity and centrally managed consent to enable individuals to access their financial information across different government agencies and financial institutions. So this means that as a resident, I can actually get my personal balance sheet on my phone with one click, and it will show my social security data from government, my tax data from government as well as all my holdings with the banks, stock exchange, as well as with the major life insurance providers, right? So this allows financial planning to be done a lot more seamlessly and all with my consent and control, right? And in the corporate domain, actually small and medium businesses also have access to the corporate version of our data platform, which is called Mindful Business, right? So this would potentially allow us to extend the use cases to ESG disclosure in support of green financing, for example, right? So I think the objective of SingPass as a national digital identity really is to realize a digital economy, right, by providing a platform that allows the flow of data across systems, organization, and potentially even national borders, right? All with the consent of the data subjects, right? So we align with our data protection laws in Singapore, right? And adopting data minimization principles in use cases so that only data relevant to the transaction are transmitted and approved, right? And we believe, you know, that the work around trust frameworks that many countries are embarking on will potentially allow us to have interoperability of digital ID across countries, right? Potentially through the use of digital identity wallets, right? And to this end, we've actually signed digital economy agreements with our trading partners. So Australia, I think is on the call, Canada is on the call, right? And we have DEAs with these countries, as well as the Agile Nations Initiative with Canada, right? To explore how we can achieve equivalence of digital identity and potentially use the digital identity of one country just as services of another, right? So to maybe just close this segment and the opening, I would just say that, right, ultimately the approach that each country will take will be different, but I think there are 4 critical success factors, right? The first is really about value creation, right? And it's really about putting the users first, right? And when we introduce digital identity, we need to consider how it brings about value to the users and make lives better for citizens, as Rachel mentioned in the beginning, right? This has to be upfront and center, focusing on specific high impact use cases. And in our case, we started with government and banking services so that people understand and buy into the value which identity can bring to them, right? The second is trust, and this is important, right, in any business, right? So users and relying parties need to trust the system, trust that it's reliable and available for use when needed, right? So in Singapore, the government plays a big role in this. If you look at the 2021 Alderman Trust Barometer, we have 68%, right, rating for trust in government. We are a small market, and I think it made sense for the government, you know, to play this role, right? But for each country, it will be different. right? In some countries, it may be better for the private sector to be in the private sector may be in a better position to do this than the government, right? But most importantly, it is about trust that the individual's privacy is sufficiently protected with the user's interests at heart, right? And in our case, we do this by adhering strictly to our data privacy legislation, right? And I think the third, which is I think what the title of this this short sharing is about, is really about inclusion, right? So a digital identity needs to serve everyone. We need to take care that the digitally excluded, right, and be able to serve the whole community, right? And it's important that we don't leave anyone behind, but more importantly, that digitalization can be a springboard for everyone, right? And I think in our case, we are a country where we have 1.5 mobile phones per person, right? So I think for us, as inclusion really means three things, right? The first is our digital identity takes the form of an app, a smartphone app, right? So it's important that if you are visually impaired, for example, we make use of the phone's operating system and accessibility features as well as the voice assistant to ensure that you're still able to use the phone even if you can't see the screen too well, right? We have also recently ensured that the app is multilingual, which means that whether you speak any of the 4 official languages in Singapore, you are able to use the phone, and even if you're not familiar with English, right? And I think the other part that's an ongoing piece of work is really we work with agencies that help the elderly and the vulnerable to learn digital technology, right? And we do this by helping them learn how to take photos with a phone, send messages to their loved ones with a phone, and to access digital payment so that they eventually are familiar with how to use a mobile phone, how to use the SingPass app, and be able to come on board, not just the digital identity, but the digital economy and digital ecosystem as a whole, right? And last but not least is actually user safety, right? And I say this because, we've been conditioned in the physical world, right? As kids, we say, don't talk to strangers. As adults, we say, don't leave your belongings unattended, right? And in the digital world, right, in the last 2 years, actually what has happened is that digitalization has been accelerated by COVID, right? Everyone is now doing things online, but do we know how to do it safely? And how do we educate users to protect themselves online so that they do not fall prey to scammers and other bad actors, right? So I thought I'll leave it at this 4, and happy to hear your views, learn from each other, and also take any questions later. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kendrick. And maybe the problem with being the moderator is I can't ask all the questions I want to ask, at least not at the moment. But that was really fascinating and gives us some really good insights to kind of start us thinking about the issues. And really interesting too about 2,000 government services kind of using this. So it's really talking about how it is making a difference for people's lives. So I will keep all my questions to one side, but I encourage other participants as well to type yours in. But now we're going to hear from the next speaker, and we're really privileged to have Nurses Yeritsayan, Deputy Governor of the Central Bank of Armenia, and he also serves as Secretary of Armenia's Information Systems Management Board, which oversees the planning and implementation of Armenia's digital transformation. And in the past, he's also served as the Minister of Economy of Armenia and has represented Armenia in a range of international organizations such as World Bank, IMF, ADB. I won't go through all the rest of his CV because we really want to hear from him about what their experience has been in Armenia. And specifically, we're going to hear now about the role of the private sector in developing national eID systems. So over to you, please. And again, can participants keep typing in your questions as we go through? Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Raquel. Thank you for this opportunity to address to this distinguished panel. Let me start by agreeing and endorsing what Kendrick concluded at the end. What are the success factors? Because I'll start from the issues in Armenia, that the system was introduced in 2011, and we are a decade down the road. And we still have this picture, which is on the slide, about all respondents, and ECENC is the office that is implementing EID in Armenia since 2011-12. And then basically people are aware that there's some sort of cards in Armenia. But 1.4 million Armenians also have cards because in one or the other way they were mandated to have the cards as part of their passports, etc. And they pay 3,000 drams, which is $6 to $7, get the cards, but only few of them use it because there are no use cases and public data are not open source and are not available in a way. Therefore, it's becoming a chicken and egg problem, basically, whether quality services online are necessary to trigger the wide use of ID cards or vice versa. You don't have an appropriate ID card system and electronic identification system and cybersecurity. Therefore, people don't trust and then don't use the identification. The other impediment we had was like this agency, public agency, is asking about $7-8 payment per annum for using their electronic signatures, and this payment discouraged people to utilize it. And this is one of the major impediments. Basically, everything is in place. Like every Armenian citizen has unique identity system. We do have personal information protection law in place. We have e-signature and electronic identity kind of legal regulatory framework. We do have the civil registration, population registry, but basically we have found out in the process of these renewed reforms that we have to unify these registries. And thanks God there is a political consent that we are going to improve our population and civil registry, that it becomes a service for the digital society. Therefore, basically we embraced ourselves, and I'm going to present the private sector perspective. We think our experience have shown that if the private sector doesn't buy in, the government is not going to impose it. And we found, and why I'm presenting this case, because basically the government understood that the finance industry is the and telecom sector is the best suited basically to champion. And the solution and investment could come from the private sector because they are also good in servicing, and therefore they'll provide excellent services under government supervision and regulation. But this regulation and supervision doesn't exist. And again, this comes to the central bank. With our qualifications and experience, we can establish a public agency, help the government to establish a public agency that will supervise and regulate. But we have changed the paradigm. The paradigm now, we say we go for an open and quality data is a critical asset. And therefore, basically, we are not targeting e-government solutions, but we want to move into e-society and electronic e-economy kind of concept. And within that concept, the EID architecture will come in. And then we have put under this vision, we put 9 targets, and I brought here 2 of them. One is that at least 1 million people have to use the identity, electronic identity on a daily basis within 2 years. And then there should not be any direct fee that citizens pays for the identity. And this is a major trigger. And then we will introduce or enforce, it's already in place, never enforced, once only principle for the public data. Therefore, if once you gave your data to the government, no one else would be asking in the government second time for the same data. And we want to impose this, basically agree at the standard level with the private sector. And here you see the architecture, but there are 4 different other layers, and you see data registry in the bottom, as you mentioned in your initial speech, Rahel. Basically, electronic identity is one layer of our digital architecture, but we want also the private sector to be convinced, trust, and embrace to this digital architecture, that we all together build a new society, a new electronic society, leaving legacies and old systems behind us, and build a new society based on a new architecture. From that perspective, the electronic identity architecture is already well advanced because we are in the process of public-private partnership tender. And here you would see the agency structures, regulatory framework, and the framework that would build trust between different participants, the citizens, banks, and the government, basically. And here the private sector is going to have a leading role, as they will provide better trust environment than basically government or the central bank. Because maybe of a societal issue, Singapore is different than Armenia. We are a bit more individualistic as a society. Therefore, the choice also comes from the cultural perspectives as well. And thanks God, our private sector, banks and telecoms want to engage. They want to invest, which is also good that the government will save on other things that are necessary to move these services basically online. There will be a centralized portal. This will be owned and managed and run by the supervisory digital. We have Information Systems Agency. It was established recently, and Central Bank is going to nurture it towards legislating the mandate and then making the funding sustainable for a couple of years. Then it will go into the government structures. And this is kind of, the concept is borrowed from Estonia. It's a centralized gateway through which both the private and public sector will be able to easily integrate their identity systems and provide secure services. And then through the bank, you can complete your car registration and vice versa. That's pretty much the architecture behind that. I showed the schemes, but I'm trying to provide a simple example how the system will work in an interoperable and open data environment. And this is done, this is ready. Now we are working on the mobile ID solutions. Smart ID will come with the tender, as these ID cards are the only solution available. This is why we have 1.4 million cards issued, only 60,000 use it only for tax filing because it's mandatory. Basically, CEOs of companies are using the identity card because they are obliged to submit their tax reports electronically. And finally, the tender, because of the public-private partnership perspective, we hired, the central bank helps the government, basically it's a joint project. We have hired a transaction advisor that have already engaged with us. We are in the middle of the process. We'll complete this by July next year. The first phase, which will be finalized by the end of November, December, will be agreeing on the business model and how we proceed with this PPP. There will be two pieces, physical document infrastructure as one tender, and the second would be certification authority plus smart ID plus mobile ID kind of solution. And basically in the second phase, we'll go into a transparent PPP kind of tender after agreeing with the government. By the end of 2023, we will have the portal, the gateway I showed, the previous one, already in place, ready and fully integrated, this one. This is the end result where people will push the button and then one or two steps, more steps, either through their phones or computers or at the spot, and they'll be identified. And as Kendrick mentioned, all the services and onboarding registration of the ID system will be done by the banks and telecom companies through their nicely furnished offices, and the service levels will be defined under the contract and enforced through the PPP kind of framework. I'll stop in there. If there are questions, I'll go into the details. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. It's really interesting to hear that presentation after Singapore, just to get a very different perspective from what's going on with the private sector. So do keep posting questions. I know there's been at least one in the chat bar, so please do carry on. We want to go now, though, to our next speaker, who is going to talk far more about that perspective from the private sector. So we've got Colleen Elliott, who's head of digital identity strategy for Microsoft, and she leads the development and execution of the private public sector, digital identity strategy at Microsoft. And she's previously worked in the Canadian public sector, looking at and leading work on business improvement and digital transformation projects for the Ontario government. I won't go through all of her CV, but she is not able to join us live at this event, so we've got a pre-recorded video. However, we do have live and kind of who is joining us, and that's Marcus Lowe from Microsoft, and he's the regional business leader for government in Asia Pacific and Japan, and I believe is based in Singapore. And he leads the partnership strategies with government in their digital transformation journey in Asia as part of worldwide public sector organization at Microsoft. And thank you. Thank you for also showing us that you are live. That's great that we can see you. And he's joining so that he can answer any questions. So now's your opportunity as we listen to this video to please put some questions there for Marcus as well. So if I can ask the team as well to play the video now. Thanks so much.
Hello, everyone. My name is Colleen Elliott, and I'm the Digital Identity Strategy Lead in Public Sector here at Microsoft. Thank you to ESCAP for inviting me to share Microsoft's perspective on how to build and scale digital ID systems without leaving anyone behind. In my presentation, I'm going to touch on our guiding principles and share some of what I've learned along the way as a public servant when I led a team to stand up a digital ID program here in a province in Canada. As some of you may know, Microsoft is the world's largest identity provider. We have an unmatched volume of authentications and security signals. Our universal identity platform, Azure Active Directory, now part of Microsoft Entra, has a complete set of features to help secure and manage identities. It is truly hyper-scale global identity service with over 1.3 billion identities across 100,000 organizations, managing over 550 million monthly active users. And on a daily basis, we have an average of 30 billion authentication requests. At Microsoft, we believe digital ID should be owned and controlled by the user without having to be dependent on any identity provider. As such, our vision for digital ID is the following. Each of us needs a digital identity we own and control, and that securely and privately stores all elements of our identity. This self-owned identity must be easy to use and give us complete control over how our identity data is accessed and used. At Microsoft, we developed a set of guiding principles as a North Star for the work we are doing to prepare for the decentralized ID model. And I believe these principles offer insights into how to implement digital ID systems without leaving anyone behind. I'm not going to go through all the principles and commitments in detail, but I think they're pertinent to this topic that we're discussing today. And I'm going to encourage you to visit aka.ms/identity principles to read the statement in detail. But I'll give you a quick overview of them before we jump into the action steps. So the 5 guiding principles are that digital ID should be secure, reliable, and trustworthy, privacy protecting and in my control, inclusive, fair, and easy to use, supervisable, and environmentally responsible. In addition to that, we've made 3 commitments to support digital ID systems being legitimate and lawful, interoperable and accessible, and safe. Now we'll focus on how to turn the principles into action. On this slide, I've outlined a number of suggestions for you to consider as you build or further develop your digital ID systems. So number 1 is conducting user research to understand user needs and barriers to adoption. So you want to consult with a diverse group of citizens, whether you're starting out or you're modernizing your current system, to understand their needs. And this isn't a one-time exercise. Identity technology is always evolving and changing. So it's important that as you evolve your system, that you bring users along that journey. Number two, you want to educate the public and key stakeholders. This is important because no government can do digital identity alone. It requires a broad set of stakeholders across the ecosystem to help ensure that the system is inclusive and works for users. And by educating your target users about the benefits of digital ID and how it works, you increase the likelihood of adoption. For example, when I conducted user research in Canada, one of the key findings was that although some users did not see the benefits of using a digital ID directly for themselves, they did see the benefits for others or for society as a whole, and as a result, were still likely to support or adopt digital ID. Number three, you want to build with users, not for them. So it's not enough to educate your users, but you must also include them in the design process. So this can be achieved through co-design sessions or through user testing. And again, this can happen if you're launching a new digital ID system or if you're simply launching new features. So I've found this activity can also be combined with educational activities. But the important thing is that you go at the pace of your users. There's new identity innovations happening all the time, but really driving the choices you make around your features of your digital ID system through the lens of user needs will ensure that your system remains inclusive. So it's all about evolving your digital ID system, not revolution. If you go too fast, you risk losing users. Number four, you want to use inclusive design principles to ensure accessibility. So don't design based on majority or assumptions about people's abilities, whether it's literacy, physical limitations or attributes, technology use, etc. The system will be easy to use if it's easy to use for those with limitations. So you want to solve for those edge cases. Number five, build on open standards for greater interoperability and security. So we built our system based on open standards, non-proprietary and accessibility principles to ensure the broadest interoperability for our customers. For example, we have a digital identity wallet in our platform that has a software development kit, which enables you to use that wallet or to build your own. So again, depending on your user needs, you'll want to make those type of design choices to ensure that your system remains aligned with user needs. And number six, you want to build trust by focusing on user safety and security. So according to the Edelman Trust Barometer, trust in government is at an all-time low. And trustworthiness is key to adoption of any service. For a digital ID system, if it's done right, it can increase user trust in online services, minimize and reduce risks around identity theft and fraud, reduce costs to deliver services, and improve access to service. But building trust also requires a strong legal framework. Users need to be assured that the proper protections are in place, that their digital ID will not be misused, or that they will not be exposed to undue harm, and that they know where to go when something goes wrong. In conclusion, to build a digital identity system that is truly inclusive, your intention must remain on centering the user. This means constantly testing and monitoring how well the system is working for those it is intended to benefit. We will continue to work to ensure that our systems work for everyone across all modalities, including online, in-person, and over the phone, and design our system based on open, accessible, and non-proprietary standards to help you achieve the broadest interoperability, ease of use, broad inclusion, and equity of access. Thank you, everyone, for having me. And now I'll turn it over to my colleague, Marcus Lowe, to address any questions you may have.
Thank you, Colleen. I think at this point we'll go on to the next presentation, but Marcus, I hope you're looking at the chat and we'll be ready to answer any questions when we come on to that in a minute. So thank you very much. Really interesting to hear a different perspective, but actually a lot of the similar kind of points as well. So really interesting. Next, we're going over to Australia. We're going to hear from Matthew Sedgwick, who's the head of Digital Identity Branch at the Australian Government's Digital Transformation Agency. And he's previously worked as Assistant Secretary in the Digital Technology Task Force at the Department of the Prime Minister and Cabinet, and has also worked in various other roles, including in Treasury, and work he's done on modernising business registers and consumer data rights. So again, from Australia, we've got a pre-recorded message from Matthew, where he's going to kind of share his experiences. So I'll ask the team to put this on, and then after this, we'll come to a time of questions. So if you can have them ready, thank you.
Hello, my name is Matt Sedgwick, and I am the head of digital identity at the Australian Digital Transformation Agency. I'm pleased to be joining you today to talk about the Australian Government Digital Identity System. First, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land in which I can meet you from, the Ngunnawal people, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders here with you today. Digital identity is one of the most significant technological developments in the world, with major benefits for governments, consumers and industry. Safe, secure and convenient digital services have never been more important. People are engaging online at unprecedented rates, accelerated by the COVID-19 pandemic. Even our activities like telehealth and remote employee onboarding. At the heart of these traditional in-person services is identity. Now we need a way to securely prove who you are online. Digital identity means that you can do your business with all levels of government completely online and without multiple passwords, saving governments and individuals time and money. Australians have continued to enthusiastically embrace digital technologies during the pandemic, a sentiment shared across the globe. Here in Australia, we've been looking at digital identity for a long time now. The Australian government's digital identity journey commenced 7 years ago as a result of the inquiry into the financial sector. The inquiry showed that a national approach to digital identity can support economic growth. Proving who you are across Australia's economy is difficult to do. Identity verification is fragmented and there isn't a consistent approach. This created a range of challenges for accessing government services, with people being asked again and again to prove their identity. To address that, the Australian government has invested in building a federated digital identity model to deliver a world-class solution that could improve digital transactions across the broader economy. The Australian government has been delivering its digital identity to enable Australians to prove who they are online and reduce the administrative burden for small and medium businesses so they can get on doing what they do. Support an increased number of Australians to access services digitally, improving privacy and accessibility, reducing identity fraud, and enable innovative digital sectors of the economy to flourish. In Australia, digital identity is estimated to save $3 billion per year to the economy from identity theft and fraud. Our system is already up and running with over 120 government services connected to it so far, with more on the way. From our perspective, this is a great achievement. More than 9 million Australians have created digital identity using the Australian Government's digital identity app called MyGovID to access a range of services. This has removed the need to physically prove who they are in a shopfront or a service centre, making it a much more seamless digital experience. Over the last 12 months, 1.3 million people used their digital identity more than once, and approximately 12,000 people use their digital identity more than 65 times with government. We've also got over 1.4 million businesses using digital identity to access services like our tax agency, reducing the administrative burden so they can get on with doing business. So we're seeing really great uptake of the system here in Australia. And we don't want to leave anyone behind. Ensuring everyone has equal access to government services is important, and digital identity supports that, especially when considering geographical barriers, caring responsibilities, and many other reasons that make it hard for people to get to a shopfront. If people don't want a digital identity or can't get one, they can usually still access government services online without digital identity, over the phone or in person. Digital identity also supports people affected by natural disasters. With a digital identity, people can avoid spending $128 in 4 hours when applying to replace identity documents. They don't have to wait up to 4 weeks for a new document before applying for assistance. We acknowledge that some people will not have the identity documents to create their digital identity or a smart device or general access to the internet. So there will always be in-person or over-the-phone options to accessing government services. Inclusion and accessibility can also be improved by allowing third parties or trusted nominees to act on behalf of citizens who are unable, either permanently or temporarily, to make direct use of public services, which may be enabled through digital identity. With more access to digital self-help services, we're also able to funnel resources into providing more support to people who really need it. To sum up, in Australia, we're building a digital identity system that helps more people access government services at all levels, at any time, from anywhere. We want to improve the way Australians interact with services so they can get on with life and reduce administrative tasks from our busy lives. This will allow us to focus on the things that are most important to us. And we want to make sure as many people as possible can benefit from digital identity. Thank you very much for your time today. I hope our presentation has assisted you with the work of your conference.
Thank you very much. So now we've got some time for questions, so do please type them in. And I can see that we have got one question already. And given that we haven't heard from Mark, and we've also got somebody in the room to ask a question as well. So brilliant. So let's go first of all. Why don't we go first of all in the room, because you're here. You get the special privilege of asking your question directly. Thanks.
Thank you so much. It's a privilege to be in the room, and thank you so much to all our speakers. My name is Andrew Byrne. I work for the UK government. I'm based here in Bangkok, where I'm the permanent representative to the UN and other things with the embassy. I had a question really about inclusion. We as UK government work on programs across this region around digital identity and also sort of around digital government services and fintech and things like that. And I noted that our speakers were emphasizing really the value of working with users, both to identify the services that can add most value when we're looking at sort of digital ID and how it can be used, how services can be accessed through digital ID, but also in terms of making it more easily accessible to users. And I think one of the things that we've really noted is that often those who are excluded are those who are hardest to reach and hardest to engage as users. They're the people who are least likely probably to step up if we try and do user engagement. And so I'd really be keen to ask our panelists, because it's something I think we're struggling with. What are the areas that you think are most, well, or we should be most collectively prioritizing when it comes to kind of government and other services that are accessible by digital ID, if we're looking at this through an inclusion lens? And what are some principles for really ensuring that we're not leaving people behind when we're thinking about inclusion in the digital ID space? Thank you.
Thank you so much for your question. And given that we've got Microsoft online and we've got Marcus and he's been hasn't been given an opportunity to talk yet, maybe I'll come to him first of all, but also just looking at the questions in the chat bar as well. So when we come to that question, perhaps as well, Marcus, you could also just think if there is anything else that you perhaps would also want to say in terms of any advice for developing countries who are actually thinking about those first steps in setting up their a digital ID system, and particularly bearing in mind Andrew's kind of question around the inclusion side of it as well. Perhaps if you could say a bit about that, then I'll come to Kendrick and nurses to both kind of reflect on that as well. So if we could go to you first, Marcus, thanks.
Sure, thank you, Rachel, for the opportunity, and Andrew for that question. I'll try my best to answer them. And if I can't answer them, I'll certainly go back and have discussions and come back to this for some answers. But I think what I would like to add is that from a policy framework point of view, I think most governments have some kind of a framework that's already been put in place. Coming from a technology company, I think we've been doing this for almost 50 years now. I think the technical challenges in terms of trying to address some of the policies is a incredibly difficult thing to resolve. So I would say then that based on our experiences and some of the technology that we've researched and put in place, we've been able to assist in accelerating this adoption of digital identity. If you hear what Colin has mentioned earlier on, research, education, having been in the industry for 30+ years myself, one of the first things that I've done for Microsoft at that point in time really was about ICT. Right. So in order to get people to use it, a desktop on every PC, which was the Microsoft motto at that point, was the ease of use. Right. So some of the things that we do around that really helps in that process of making sure that when you launch a product, a solution, an initiative, the technology doesn't impede them, but it serves as an accelerator, which is why Colin emphasized on the most common denominator, which is to reach the edge of the users. And we have had a lot of research that's done around that. And when you apply that to that process, I feel that it's a very important partnership that we bring to the table globally. Of course, there's a lot of other things that was mentioned, but I just wanted to add that part. I think usability is such an important component. Otherwise, nobody's going to be using what we've developed for the citizens.
Thank you. And maybe we can come to Kendrick, if you wanted to share some reflections as well on the kind of issues of inclusion, but also any advice to countries actually looking at what they can do to develop their national digital ID systems. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Rachel. So I'll just try to summarize, maybe just taking points from various questions I see on the chat. Right. So I think there was a question online about whether there's a few step formula or something, and I'm not exactly sure I can prescribe something like that, because as we said, every country's situation and context is different. But I think one observation we've had from looking at the development of digital ID in various countries is that actually many countries have some form of digital ID in some form or other already, right? So some countries may have chip cards, for example, right? And I think to Nara's point earlier about having something in place, but not really having the adoption and the usage and the scale that perhaps we desire, right? I think our observation really is that it's about finding the right model. So earlier our Domain Trust Index was quoted, right? So I quoted it as saying that the trust in government is high in Singapore, but it's also been mentioned that the trust in government globally is low, right? So I think it's really about saying, look, what is the right model? Who do people trust? And therefore, who is best placed to implement the digital ID, right? And what should government's role be, right? So in Singapore, the government's role has been to do a lot more, including building infrastructure. But if you think about who should lead, right? Government-led versus business-led, direct provisioning versus federation. I think the reality is to map it up in the 2x2, you realize that for each country, that sweet spot will be different, right? So I think the first step really is to, I think in this time and age where digital is a lot more prevalent than it used to be, understanding which quadrant, right, our countries lie in, and therefore which model we should take, who should lead, who should provide. I think is probably the most important step to decide. And once you decide that and you decide correctly, right, then all the other steps will become very clear and will unfold by themselves quite naturally, right? And then maybe to answer the question that was in the room about how to go about, doing this, I think a few things is really coming back to what I said. It's really about prioritizing the use cases that are high impact and where users truly believe, right, that the digital is the way to go, right? And I think for us, it's been government services, it's been banking services. We find them to be quite similar, right? Because to some degree, there is a financial element to it, there is a provision element to it, there's a certain trust level to it, right? And there's a certain importance of knowing the customer and knowing who the citizen is. So we found that that has allowed people to accept, right, that digital identity is a useful thing, right? And once we cemented that, right, then we found that scaling it and expanding it to other use cases became a little bit easier because people had accepted that this is indeed a better way to do things, right? And in terms of trying to reach the people who are harder to reach, then I think that's where the community plays a very important part, right? So earlier I talked about how we teach the elderly and the vulnerable. It's actually through other elderly and vulnerable, right? So when we organize outreach in terms of helping our residents go digital, we actually have, a grandmother who's savvy with technology, teaching another grandmother how to take the photos, how to use WhatsApp, how to use the messaging apps to connect with the rest of their family, for example, right? So I think there's this element of government and NGOs organizing the activity, but adopting a train-the-trainer approach, right, where someone like me, right, teaches me something that I'm not familiar with, right? So some sharing, hope that's useful. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I think given time, I'm just going to move straight on to nurses to see if you've got any reflections as well on the questions we've heard, but also the ones in the chat bar. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'll start from a statement that I learned from the Estonian Chief Information Officer who is advising me in this journey. He said the CIO's nightmare is like everybody, all the citizens accept some sort of identity because they have to live and then perform, but why they don't accept the electronic identity? That's the nightmare of the CIO, and pretty much the questions are in this direction. Basically to address this issue from our own experience, because I've also presented you a case of some sort of failure in a way on which we are learning on our own kind of mistakes. We agreed with the government that we change the paradigm, and that explains, that answers the question. There is no e-government solutions. Historically, when Singapore started, government could trigger some services because online services, e-commerce, banks were not automated, etc., etc. Therefore, it made sense to start somewhere, then evolve over time. Now, opportunities are much more to provide services. Therefore, there should be shift in the paradigm. I also think by the IFIs and internationals that are basically promoting these policies, the paradigm should be shift from e-government to e-society and e-economy solutions, bringing all the stakeholders together. It makes the life tougher because you have to negotiate, you have to understand, but that's how you build the trust environment. Therefore, for the developing countries, I would advise, as we do in Armenia now, spend time with the private sector, with different stakeholders, to build the trust environment that they expect the government or the private sector to deliver on the services. And I usually bring the example of the supermarket. If only a sausage is available online and the rest you should go to the supermarket, are you going to compromise your experience of going to supermarket, touching goods and buying it? Therefore, there should be critical amount of services available that people embrace to digital ID, basically. And then they evaluate it, they pay, they use it for the services. And the government services are limited nowadays. This is why we agreed with the government that banking, online banking, banking services, most of our population have access to bank accounts. Therefore, the delivery channels could be changed. and the government would become the free rider of these new delivery channels, rather than vice versa. But government open data policies are also key for the private sector to leverage and provide additional services to the household. In terms of reaching out to the remote, I think if public-private NGO type of services, data is available, most of the people, even in developing countries, use smartphones. Therefore, if you have a smartphone, there might be a way of delivering services through the smartphone. And we pay attention because we have introduced cashless economy kind of concept, a law in place. And we try to go to villages and understand why people don't use cash, why people don't use credit cards, etc., etc. The point is, for example, the post offices, if they had access to all sorts of social and health information at the consent of the household, they could provide combined services. Then people would be introduced to the system and start using the services which would bring the identity kind of solutions into play. Therefore, we don't believe, and it doesn't work in classroom learnings, education programs. This could be integrated in curriculums, etc., etc., but allowing all the participants to access to quality data and then provide integrated services is the solution. Therefore, more participants in the market, more chances that people will embrace and learn from each other, because they'll hear that somebody has sold his car or her car through a bank account, for example. That simple message will bring everybody in. Or if somebody heard that getting his pension, for example, you don't need to move anywhere else but push a button in your phone. That would move people around, and then from mouth to mouth, things will spread, basically, and that's how things will go. For the developing countries, I consider Armenia developing a bit already mid and up, but in a way, don't do half-pregnant things. You'll make more harm to your society than benefit, and then in a way, costs will be much higher later on. And under the current circumstances, we are already in the midst of 21st century. Don't go for sole government solutions. Government is not the way to basically champion and basically encourage people to have wider use of identity, basically. Try to negotiate with the private sector that they promote the ID. In the Armenian case and many other countries, we do have this EID, GovID, and we have all sorts of other IDs. Every bank, every single bank has invested, thanks God, not much. We can stop this process now through negotiations because the sunk costs are not big. But at some point in many countries, for example, in Finland, it wasn't possible because the banks have invested so much into their identity systems that it's not possible to integrate them. Therefore, the second paradigm after moving from e-gov to e-society or e-economy, the second paradigm, and we had very tough discussions internally, we don't use, and you saw the gateway, it was labeled national ID, because initially it was labeled GovID. And I saw the Australian case, this is why they have only 1.2 million users as citizens. Government solutions should be accepted by the private sector. And banks are perceived as the best risk managers, and telecoms as well. And their sanitary system around security and safety is much tougher than governments in the developing countries. Therefore, moving this paradigm, those are not only words, these are concepts. No government ID, go for national ID, which means more negotiations in terms of building the trust environment before buying the hard, soft, and then putting the box for services. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And I'm really sorry that, as ever, we've run out of time. But I just wanted to say a huge thank you to all of the speakers, those who've been able to really share your experiences. But thank you as well for your openness, sharing not just about the benefits of national and legal identification, but also the challenges that you're facing, you know, in the different countries as well. So I think there's been lots there that we can look at and lots that we can learn about. And although we've seen that the country and the context may vary, a lot of the issues are the same around things to do with inclusion, trust, openness, interoperability of systems. So it was great to hear these different range of experiences. And I hope as well that today we've also been able to really learn from what others are doing. So it's great to hear about the examples, not just from the speakers, but also in their presentations, talking about how they've been learning from other countries like Canada, Estonia, from that much wider group of countries, and how we're all learning from each other. So I'd like to say thank you so much to the speakers, but also thank you to everyone for attending today. And you can see the event and the record of the sessions and presentations will be available afterwards as well. But thanks so much for coming today. Goodbye.
Bye.
Goodbye.